All right. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Welcome to this joint event of Politics in a Pint and Theology on Tap. My name is Catherine Montgomery, and I work in campus ministry. So thank you for this incredible turnout. We're very excited about this talk that you're going to hear and this wonderful individual that you're going to get to meet this afternoon. Again, this event is part of our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week events, the Poor People's Campaign being the focus of our week and the different speakers that you have heard throughout the week. So we're grateful that you continue to dig into this topic. Before we begin this afternoon, I'm going to ask you to turn to someone around you that you don't know and introduce yourself, let them know a little bit about yourself, and if you can share why you came today. And I know for some of you, you might be here for a classroom requirement. That is quite all right, but what are you hoping to learn from this event? So just take a minute, say hi to someone, welcome them here. All right, it is wonderful to hear the energy in the room. We're very excited. And now it is my privilege to introduce more formally our speaker this afternoon. So this in front of me is Eric Martin, and Eric teaches religion at UCLA and recently finished a PhD in theology at Fordham University. He spent the last 3 years in Charlottesville, Virginia, joining the anti-Confederate movement there and living in the Charis community, a house church dedicated to tending the land, anti-racist action, and hospitality for immigrants seeking asylum. An oblate of the Catholic Worker and a self-proclaimed failing poet, though I doubt that, he has co-edited the Berrigan Letters, 4 Orbis books, and is currently writing an anti-fascist theology against white supremacist idolatry. So today, Eric is going to share some reflections on Dr. King's view of militarism in the context of what he would call the 3 major evils: war, poverty, and racism. So we're grateful to have Eric here. Please help me to welcome him today.
Thank you. I have no clue what this sounds like. Can people hear me? All right. I can't see everyone. I'm going to stand up. It's lovely being here at how Benedict talks about welcoming the guests like Christ, which is always kind of ambiguous because Christ was welcomed by some people by plotting to kill him. So I'm always like, I don't know if I want to be welcomed like Christ, but I feel like I got that welcome here in a good way. But a lot of good people here, so thank you. Yeah, so I want to talk about Dr. King, and I think I want to introduce the talk the way I think Dr. King should be introduced. I want to read 2 paragraphs from Angela Davis. She's got a great book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. So if you'll indulge me to introduce the talk this way with Angela Davis. She says, when we focus our attention on the Southern struggles of the 50s and 60s, specifically when we think about the Montgomery bus boycott, we inevitably evoke Dr. Martin Luther King. I never tire of urging people to remember that it was not a single individual or 2 who created that movement, that as a matter of fact, it was largely women within collective context, black women, poor black women who were maids, washerwomen, and cooks. These were the people who collectively refused to ride the bus. These are the people whom we have to thank for imagining a different universe and making it possible for us to inhabit the present. We tend to think individualistically, and we assume that only heroic individuals can make history, and that's why we like to focus on Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a great man and who should get focus. But in my opinion, his greatness resided precisely in the fact that he learned from a collective movement. He transformed his relationship with that movement. He did not become a single individual who was going to bring freedom to the oppressed masses. And I start this way because I think it's important to avoid what can approach a certain kind of hero worship that can paralyze people into thinking that heroes like Dr. King are aliens and they're not like us, and we sort of leave the work up to these people. We can slough off all our personal responsibility. But it's also sort of stifling us as a person. I'm not like Dr. King, I'm not like Dorothy Day or Gandhi, so I don't know what I can do. And I want to avoid that because I've seen this in action with a lot of people who are not Gandhi or Dr. King or Dorothy Day, who do wonderful things, who do things that they do, not that these quote-unquote heroes do, but is nonetheless valuable. So I want to bear that in mind as we move forward. So I was asked basically to talk a little bit about Dr. King, particularly his views on militarism and the war economy, and maybe tell a few stories coming from the present through communities and movements I've been able to see. So to start with Dr. King. Cheers, hold on. Dr. Cornel West says, we're in danger of Santa Clausifying Dr. King, that he's become a Santa Claus figure, sort of stripped of all specificity, just seen as a jolly old man everyone can get on board with. I have some Trump-loving people who a couple days ago on Dr. King Day said, oh, it's good that we remember Dr. King because he was all about unity. And I said, yeah, and against white supremacy. And they said, what? This is the Santa Clausified image, right? It's someone for unity, for peace, for nonviolence, for justice, whatever that might mean. But it's good to hold in mind that Dr. King was against racism, militarism, and materialism. And not just against those three, not just against racism, but against white supremacy. Not just against militarism, but against American imperialism. And not just against materialism, but against capitalism. He was a democratic socialist. So it's important to hold these in mind because in 1965, he took a big turn. In February of 65, Malcolm X is assassinated in New York. And from that point on until he is assassinated in April of 68, he starts to sound more and more like Malcolm or like a Black Panther. He never sacrificed his commitment to nonviolence, but he started to lose faith and optimism in what white people and white culture is capable of. He started to talk more openly about America in very critical ways. And he denounced the presence of nuclear weapons very strongly. He turned towards an anti-militarist attitude, especially as the Vietnam War was revving up. And he said of nuclear weapons, now is the time that we recognize it's either nonviolence or non-existence. Because 20 some odd years earlier, he had witnessed the news reports of bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 200,000 people, which is, I don't know the math, but somewhere around 70 9/11s. And with this power, they were more powerful by that time, and they're far more powerful now, these nuclear weapons. He said, if we use them, we're done. That's it. And I want to return to that with movements today. So he turned a critical eye towards this. In 1967, 1 year before his death to the day, on April 4th, 1967, in Riverside Church in New York, he gave a speech coming out against the Vietnam War, which was not at all a popular move. It wasn't popular with white people, and it wasn't popular with the black population either. And he condemned in very strong terms American militarism, specifically in Vietnam, but also in general terms. And so if you allow me, I want to read, I'm not going to do this anymore, reading 2 paragraph sections, but I want to read 2 paragraphs from this speech because it identifies, or it exemplifies what he talked about elsewhere as the triplets: racism, materialism, and militarism. And here's how he wove them together in his talk. There's a very obvious connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, it seemed as if there was a real promise for hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings, but then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program get broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw people and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. And again, he's a Baptist preacher. To call something demonic is about as strong a language you get. It became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their children and siblings and spouses to fight and die in high proportions. We were taking the black young men who had already been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in South Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we've been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. We watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of poor Vietnamese villagers, but we realize they would never live in the same block in Detroit. And I cannot be silent in the face of this cruel manipulation of the poor. So he's weaving together American imperialism, capitalism, the draining of funds away from social uplift and white supremacy. People who could be benefiting from this, specifically people of color, are not getting it because it's going to bomb people. And this is in the midst of a buildup that would kill 2 million people in Vietnam, which is a third of the Holocaust, which is what the American government did in Vietnam. And so this became a central feature of the rest of his short life for the remaining 1 year of his life. And it got to the point where in 1968, well, elsewhere, even in that speech, he said that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which is very strong. I mean, this is in the context of the Cold War, where the communists are supposed to be the enemy, and the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, is trying to tag him as a communist. And instead of trying to defray the criticism, he's going in on the other side. He's saying, we're the greatest purveyors of violence in the world. It's very strong language. And when he was killed, he was working on a sermon called Why America May Go to Hell. And so you can see the trajectory. He sort of kept radicalizing. He sort of did the opposite of probably what many of you have heard from your parents. I definitely heard from mine. So, well, you can be interested in social movements when you're young, but when you get old, you'll see, you're going to become more conservative. He did the exact opposite. He turned 30 whatever and just kept right on radicalizing. And I want to read a much, much shorter section from the Drum Major Instinct, which is a sermon he gave before he died and after the Vietnam speech that makes just a little more concisely his point. God did not call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God did not call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war in Vietnam. We are criminals in that war. We have committed more war crimes almost than any nation in the world. And we won't stop because of our pride and our arrogance as a nation. And so when Dr. King Day comes, or if you go see the Dr. King Memorial in DC, it's a very, they like to show pictures with him and an American flag in the background as if he was sort of the ultimate patriot. In a sense, he embraced the idea of America much better than the white culture that had the foot on the necks of people of color. But on the other hand, he was incredibly critical of America because he paid attention to historical data and got specific. And so again, when we talk about Dr. King, it's important to be specific, that he was a radical leftist, that he was against American imperialism, that he was against capitalism, and that he was against white supremacy, not just for peace, et cetera, et cetera. He was for peace. So with these triplets, I've been asked to sort of bring it to today, and maybe in the context of a few stories. The triplets are very obvious. If you look anywhere, you look at Ferguson, you can see hyper-militarization of our home front, on the domestic front, with the police getting weapons from the military, confronting people of color, the draining of resources that should go to programs of social uplift, but instead using it against people, showing solidarity with someone who was killed by police and left in the streets for hours. So the triplets are very obvious there, but I can maybe speak more directly to two other places. One is, this is close to you all, Standing Rock. It happened in the Dakotas with the Lakota Nation resisting the pipeline going in. And so I went to Standing Rock. There was a group of Catholic workers, and I went on that trip. And it's very clear there. It's capitalism meeting militarism, meeting white supremacy. How capitalism? It's a company going in and putting an oil pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's clearly white supremacy. It was supposed to originally go through a nearby town that was majority white. Naturally, people don't want an oil pipeline going through their water supply because all oil pipelines eventually leak, as the Dakota Access Pipeline has since started leaking into the river that they eventually put it into, which was the whole fight to prevent this. And understandably, the white people said, we don't want this oil pipeline here threatening our water supply. So they said, okay, we'll go do it to the Lakota water supply. Nobody criticized the white community that said, we don't want this pipeline here, but all of a sudden the Lakota Nation doesn't resist, and there's a whole bunch of pushback. Pushback by a hyper-militarized force. When we got there, it was very obvious. There are helicopters flying overhead, interrupting your sleep. There are floodlights on the hills going down in the valley where the camp was. You were always aware of the military. You go out on the road and you turn right, and you can't walk 200 yards before you run into military vehicles blocking your access to the street. It was very present there. But what wasn't obvious, but what came out later, there were documents that showed there was a company called Tiger Swan that was doing security. And this company made money by treating the water protectors, the Lakota and those who showed up in solidarity with them, as terrorists. Their documents called them enemies, terrorists. They called the camp where we were sleeping battleground. So you can see where this logic leads. It leads to the brutality against Native Americans, and that's exactly what we saw there. And this is if I could share one story. I mean, there are many stories that came there. Wonderful stories, horrific stories. I want to tell one that it was our second full day there. Typically on any given day, the Lakota elders will lead those who are willing to risk arrest somewhere. You don't quite know where because it's a given that there are FBI agents everywhere, so the plans are not announced at first. So if you're willing to maybe get arrested doing something with someone, hop in the car and go. So there were maybe 50 to 70 cars that went, we landed up going to a jail where there are a lot of Lakota women imprisoned. And so the Lakota elders wanted to hold a prayer there outside of the jail to remember these women, but also the many women of the Lakota nation, but also indigenous women everywhere who've been killed, who've been raped, who've been abused by white settler colonialism. And so when we got there, the police headed us off at a train track, blocked us. They had their shields, they had their masks, they had their batons, they had their mace, they had their name tags covered, which is not acceptable protocol for police, such that if anybody did anything, we would not be able to know who to report committed this crime. So not a good sign. And the Lakota elders said, we will just do our prayer here. White sisters, white brothers, please kneel in front of us, if you will, to form a barrier, given that the police are less given to perform violence upon white bodies than people of color. And so they held their prayer service. And the elder woman who was leading it had a big eagle feather, and she angrily swiped it and said to the police, why are you protecting the companies instead of the people? Why are you protecting the Dakota Access Pipeline instead of us? That's poison that's going to go in our water. And the police started closing in, and up came a tank, which was absurd. I go, what kind of system meets prayer with a tank? I don't even know what to say. There's your militarization and your capitalism and your white supremacy all roped into one tight cordon. And they maced us, and they sprayed us. I don't know the difference between mace and pepper spray. They did one. It was terrible. And they started grabbing people and arresting whoever they could grab. And the Lakotas yelled, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be arrested for this. Go back to your cars and drive away. Meet at the camp. So the police literally chased us, trying to grab who they could. So we all ran to the cars. We got in, and we all stopped. And we didn't know why we stopped. Turned out the police had stopped us. So they've got us in from the front and the back. So literally we got 50 to 70 cars just stuck. And we didn't know what was happening. But they rolled up a bus and took out every indigenous person they could find out of the cars and put them into the bus to be arrested. And they left every single person who seemed to be white. And we had a very young indigenous woman in our car. We were in a big Suburban with about 8 people, 9 people squeezed in. And when we realized what they were doing, we buried her underneath whatever we could find in the car. So they passed us up and did not take her. But I remember, everyone obviously was very upset. And bad question. Someone asked, how are you doing? Just to check in. Of course, she's not doing well. All her people are being pulled in, and someone in the car said, I'm sorry this is happening. She says, this has been happening for 5 centuries. And it really just drove home the point that as white people, we have separate roles. It's important for white people to engage in this work. She would have been arrested if not for white people acting as a buffer. There probably would have been more police brutality if white people were not a buffer there. And it's not on people of color to resist white supremacy as much as it is a problem for white people to dismantle it, to smash it. It's a problem for everyone. But I think that white people in the crowd, myself included, need to feel a special responsibility for it, whether or not we created these systems. We are inheriting the privilege that goes with it. So anyway, Ferguson, Standing Rock. I don't want to go on with too many stories, but I do want to tell one from Charlottesville that I think is really exemplary. I lived in Charlottesville for several years through, especially the time that made it famous during the Unite the Right rally in 2017, that I'm sure you're mostly familiar with. I'm never quite sure what people know about it. It's very strange. There was a lot of organizing done before that. Well, I'll skip that part. I guess I want to tell a two-part story that I really think exemplifies the type of white supremacy that is still very alive and acceptable today. Not just amongst white supremacists that are overt, but also just mainstream liberal white culture. There's a man named Corey Long. Corey Long showed up on August 12, 2017 to resist the neo-Nazis, the KKK, the alt-right who came to have their rally there. A lot of the anti-fascists showed up because we believed they should not be able to get their message out. We're not against the First Amendment, we're against violence. It's a separate issue. And their rhetoric turns to violence. You cannot preach genocide against Jews. You cannot preach the annihilation of queer people. You cannot preach the forcible removal of black people and people of color and the subjugation of women. You cannot do this because it leads to violence. Furthermore, the First Amendment doesn't say anything about how citizens interact with citizens. It's about the government stopping you from speaking. So it's not a violation of the First Amendment to try and block their access to the park. So we did try and block their access to the park. And eventually, when the police finally got involved, yada, 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 there was a whole riot, you saw it. The police eventually got involved and said, this is over. We successfully stopped the rally from happening, so they did not get to preach their hate over the airwaves. They're all funneling out of one very small staircase in the park, all these white supremacists with their Confederate and Nazi flags and Hitler shirts and et cetera, et cetera. And an old white man went up to Corey Long, who's a young black man, and his friend, who was also black, and asked for protection. He was scared of these people coming out. So they said, yeah, go ahead and stand behind us. And someone threw a spray can at Corey Long. Corey Long took out his lighter and made a makeshift little flame with it to ward people off who were coming out so they couldn't come near this guy or him because he'd already been spit on and called a lot of names that don't belong to him. Corey Long was arrested. Oh, shortly after that happened, while he was spraying this flame, which was touching nobody, but just keeping people at a distance, he was shot at by the Grand Wizard of the KKK coming out of, I believe, North Carolina, called the N-word. The Grand Wizard of the KKK was not charged with attempted murder. He was only charged with firing a gun within 500 feet of a school. All this happened on video. You can find it on YouTube. Corey Long was arrested. Corey Long went to jail, given a 20-day sentence. Corey Long lost his job. He was forced in this position. He didn't ask to protect this guy. He didn't touch anybody. And he went to jail and lost his job. In a separate event, I got arrested in Charlottesville. I got arrested not that day, as we had planned. I was with the clergy group. We had planned to just get arrested, but it turned out the police were nowhere to be seen at first. Or actually, they were very seen. They were around the corner behind barricades just watching the whole brawl happen, literally doing nothing until they finally came out. 20 minutes later. Jason Kessler is the man who organized all this violence in Charlottesville. He's a white supremacist who went to the University of Virginia. And he came back on campus 8 months later, after all these events happened. And when I say these events, I should have mentioned, on August 11th, the night before this Unite the Right rally, he led a torch-lit mob on the UVA's campus, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." They went to the Thomas Jefferson statue, the godfather of white supremacy of America. It's very purposefully, they went there. And they assaulted students. They assaulted UVA employees, library employees, professors who went there with their lit torches. And this is on camera. And again, the police were present. You can find these reports. They were literally across the street and did not intervene. The UVA president knew this was going to happen, not the violence, but knew this march was going to happen, did nothing to provide security there. And everyone that I knew just assumed Jason Kessler was banned from campus because he led this mob. He was not. He showed up 8 months later on campus, harassing Jews, harassing women in the law school, which was very upsetting. So a week later, he came back, and someone from the clergy group called and said, "Can you be here? Jason Kessler's here." I said, "Yeah, sure." And so I voluntarily, it's a long story, they gave him a private study space in the library to avoid a scene. So you have this white supremacist who's led a mob assaulting people on campus, given a special privilege that other people do not get, this private study space. And a lot of people were very upset. I walked to the scene, students are crying, people are very confused as to why this had happened. So I just decided I'll just go in his office. I'm not gonna do anything, I'm just gonna read, but I want it made clear he doesn't get his special space. So I was arrested and I was banned from campus, which is insane. But I never spent a day in jail aside from that day. I did not get a sentence. My sentence was totally commuted. All I got was a fine, and I didn't end up paying the fine. The community paid the fine. So unlike Corey Long, who committed nothing but the crime of defending himself and someone who asked him for defense, without touching anybody, he's a black man. He loses his job. He goes to jail. I, as a white person, voluntarily plan to do this thing, and I do it, and I don't go to jail, and I get invited to give talks about it. And this is what white supremacy looks like. This is it, right? Like me being here is a manifestation of white supremacy very clearly. That Corey Long goes to jail and I go off to give talks, and I get a great beer. But what the point is Dr. King is not a museum artifact that we observe and we say, this history is fascinating. It's very much alive, right? The people who showed up in Charlottesville, some of them were from the Jim Crow era when Dr. King was doing his thing, from both sides too. We had people in Charlottesville very much from both sides on that. It's not a dead issue, it's very much alive. Oh, hello. Sorry, I haven't been looking at you all. So when we talk about the legacy of Dr. King, which is really talking about the legacy of the civil rights movements, and I do not want to exclude the history of the Black Power movement, which often gets left out of the narrative. We're not talking about a thing that we study because it's interesting. It's not an ossified thing we examine. It's a thing that we take up. It is a legacy available to people of color, but also very much available in the responsibility of white people as well, as it was back then, as you saw many white people join. There's a great PBS Freedom Riders documentary that talks about the role of white people in that movement. I think it's just called Freedom Riders if you're interested in it. And so what is it to be anti-war today? It cannot be separate from being anti-white supremacist. It cannot be separate from being anti-capitalist. It's the biggest money-making thing we have in the capitalist system is war. It's trillions of dollars a year. And obviously that makes people uncomfortable. And it's separate from condemning all police individually. It's separate from condemning soldiers or Marines individually. That's not the point. The point is to look at things systemically. But all individuals should also question, what is my role within these systems? So I want to just leave on a brief note, the plowshares movement, I think is someone who's an interesting manifestation of white people taking upon themselves a certain responsibility. The plowshares movement was started in 1980, but the most recent action happened in Kings Bay Naval Base in Georgia. 7 people affiliated with a Catholic worker, including Liz McAllister, who's basically, when we talk about the Barricans, we're talking about Liz McAllister. Dorothy Day's granddaughter, Martha Hennessy, was a part of this. The Jesuit, Steve Kelly, was a part of this, and 4 other Catholic workers broke into Kings Bay Naval Base in Georgia and they symbolically enfleshed the text of Isaiah chapter 2. They'll beat their swords into plowshares. Nations shall make war no more. So the idea is we don't have swords that we go to war with anymore, but we do have nuclear weapons. So they went in with signs of Dr. King denouncing nuclear weapons. They went in with a sledgehammer. They went in with messages of love. And they symbolically hammered upon a copy of a nuclear warhead, breaking and entering. They're facing over 20 years in jail. They've been found guilty, and they're still waiting on their sentencing date. But this is very much alive. And they've been obviously heavily criticized. I was there for the trial, and I remember one person in the van pulled up and said, "Is this the trial for those people?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Why did they have signs of Dr. King?" I said, "Well, Dr. King, they were holding signs that says the ultimate logic of racism is genocide, and we say the ultimate logic of nuclearism is omnicide, or Trident is omnicide, nuclear-capable submarines." And he said, "Yeah, but Dr. King never broke the law. They shouldn't be holding his sign." And again, this goes back to the specificity. This is not part of the collective memory. Dr. King was a criminal. That's incredibly important, that he was a criminal. To be in a movement for justice with any sort of specificity means at some point that you are against some part of the law, because white supremacy is codified. It is not just an attitude people have. It is part of the legal system, every system in which we exist. And so I hope for Dr. King Week, we all feel invited, rather than being alienated by a grand patriarch in the movement, I hope we all feel invited into it as something that is not intimidating, but something animating and enlivening, something very much available to all of you that you don't have to go to New York or LA for or some big city. It's present right here. There's white supremacy here. I don't know the specifics of your campus, but I guarantee it's present here in the systems you have in town, in the college. And I invite all of you, I'm sure some of you already do this, I invite some of you to get involved, find out who's already doing work here, and join with them, ask how you can aid in what they're doing. And if you have your own way that you want to do it, good, go get going on your own way, but work in conjunction with the groups that are already doing it, specifically groups that are mainly constituted by people of color. See how you can work together. And it's not an intimidating thing. I'm I grew up in the suburbs. I like baseball. I'm in a Trump family. I was not sort of a born radical. It's just something, if you care about people and you love people, then you want to resist the systems that dehumanize them. And maybe on a last note, since I mentioned the word patriarch, since it's a Catholic campus and we're talking about a patriarch in the movement, it's not an isolated thing that exists only in the political realm. It's religious too, right? The most naked patriarchy in possibly the world is the Catholic Church, right? Women specifically cannot partake in the power systems in the church because they can't be priests, bishops, popes, etc. It's absurd. I'm a Catholic, I should say this. It's absurd. There's no reason we should tolerate this whatsoever. Let us learn not just to apply it to white supremacy, but to see how all these intersections connect. To be against white supremacy is to be against the subjugation of queer people, which the church is complicit in, defining them as objectively disordered, is to be against the subjugation of women. And to be a feminist, to be a queer liberationist, it intersects heavily with being anti-white supremacy. So I guess I just want to conclude on that note and invite you all to the dismantling of all these isms, the patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. Do not be intimidated by it. But mostly I just want to hear from you, so I'm going to be quiet now. I've met a lot of people with really good things to say, so as I understand it, we're going to have some sort of back and forth. I'd like it to be mostly back rather than forth, so feel free to take up as much time as you want talking. I don't know who takes over here, but thank you very much.
So if you have a question or something that you would like to comment on and share with the group, we'll pass the mic around, and Eric will hopefully help us dialogue through that.
I'll start with a question then, even though I am the one passing around the microphone.
What
At the
is your
very
name? Quinlan?
Yeah, my name is Quinlan.
Quinlan.
Thank you for speaking. I appreciated a lot of what you said. At the very end, you talked about existing systems, especially within the political sphere, that promote some of these structural inequalities. Are there any very specific policies that you think should be changed to ameliorate or alleviate some of these inequalities that exist in our society? Like, what are the most egregious examples, you would say, if that kind of makes sense?
You talking on the national level?
Sure.
Governmental policy?
Yeah, governmental.
Sure. Thank you, yeah. I mean, eventually I'd like to turn that question back to you all because I am not a person of answers, but much more of questions. I mean, since it's a talk specifically supposed to be on Dr. King on militarism, the military budget, it's, you've all seen probably those bumper stickers, like, it'll be nice when the military has to have a bake sale and schools get trillions of dollars every year. I used to teach school in Watts. There's no money there. There were holes in the walls of my classroom. There were no books in a first grade classroom. And I didn't see any white people in my classroom either. I just thought, wow, it's not like this in Beverly Hills right around the corner, I'm sure. So the public policy of where our money goes, the huge drainage of maintaining hundreds of military bases around the world, literally around the world, developing nuclear weapons. I cannot remember the number, but it's in the trillions. We're about to rehaul our nuclear weapons stockade. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. What do we need thousands for? Dr. King would say, what do we need one for? So yeah, I don't know how, it's a very blatant place to start, a very obvious place to start, is the allocation of money. It would be pretty easy to pay for reparations if you weren't paying trillions of dollars in nuclear weapons, or to begin paying reparations. I mean, there's 1,000 ways to go. I would also be curious to hear what any of you guys to say, but I guess that's kind of punting. But if anyone has another question, great. But also, if you want to chip in answering that, I would be interested in what everyone else thinks too.
Can you speak? Yeah, speak up. When you were growing up, I think a big issue with like this kind of thing is that we don't have people that look like us talking about these issues. And so for you, being a white guy, when and how did you like attain all these, or not attain, form all these like opinions in your outlook on the world, and like who might have like helped you and showed you? Did you say you were in a Trump family?
Yeah.
So I'm asking who kind of like showed you all this.
Sure. Yeah. So I hope everybody could hear that.
Could you
repeat
the question, Eric?
Yeah. Thank you. And what's your name? I can hear you. What is it? David. So the question was basically, I mean, I'm white. Where did I get any of this from? Because it didn't come from my Trump family. Some of it did come from my Trump family. I had a kindergarten teacher as a mom who, in my opinion, I'm just living out the values she taught me. Just very different in the specifics, but. I mean, I was obsessed with Dr. King as a kid because I got the narrative that he's a great individual, which I realize that I'm invoking Angela Davis here and kind of talking down the idea of a great individual, but I do think he was an admirable, his life as a civil rights activist was very admirable. But it was never specific, so I guess someone just asked me this earlier today. I started reading Noam Chomsky in high school, and it was sort of like, in the way Harry Potter's like, oh, I'm a wizard and everything's different now. There's a secret history. I said, oh, there's this secret history I never knew about us blowing everybody up, like in Central, what were we doing in Grenada? Why were we bombing Panama? I had never heard of these things whatsoever. I mean, raise your hand if you knew we went to Panama. Yeah, a couple people. That should be huge news, right? Who knew that we killed 2 million people in Vietnam? Raise your hand if you knew we killed 2 million people in Vietnam. Right? How many people were killed in the Holocaust? How many Jews died? Everybody knows the Germans' crimes, right? We can quantify the Germans' crimes, but we cannot quantify our own crimes, which goes to your question, right? Why are we not learning these things? I think a better question than what specific sources, and I will actually answer your question, is why is it the case that you have to dig for these sources? What does this mean about our education system from kindergarten onwards, right? The textbooks in Charlottesville, where I live, taught kids that slaves immigrated, quote unquote, to America. That's what people learn, right? So this is a serious problem. I'm offended as a teacher, but also just a human being. Angela Davis is someone who very much influenced me. It started with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn in American history, but probably more than anyone racially, it was Malcolm X. I encourage if any of you have not read Malcolm X's autobiography, it could be the best book ever written. I recommend starting there in terms of race. But yeah, also if anybody wants to throw other things in, I'm all ears because I could use more resources too, so feel free. Thank you, David. Yeah. Thank you.
I happen to know a little bit about this from knowing you, Eric, but could you talk a little bit about the role that faith has had in your activism or on this path that you've taken? How has it impacted the work that you've done?
Sure, that's a good. Yeah, I don't think we have enough time to talk about that, but that's a big topic. So I'm a part of the Catholic worker movement. I have no clue how much you all know about it, but I'm assuming a baseline here. It's a movement based on serving poor people. That's the way it's typically described, but really it's being in community with those in need and recognizing that you're also in need of community. And I think I grew up Catholic. I became an atheist in college. I read philosophy, and God just didn't make any sense. It seemed empirically falsifiable that God existed. It was like, well, look at the history of injustice. There literally could be no God like that in the Bible. Oddly, I read Seven Storey Mountain by Thomas Merton through various circumstances, and that just got me interested again, and I lived on a Benedictine monastery in Ireland to try and figure out the world. I did not figure out the world, but I did enjoy the monastery, and I just thought, I want to know what these monks know. And they invited me to stay and become a monk. And after maybe a month of wandering around considering it in these beautiful grass fields, I just could not justify. I think being a monk is amazing, and it's a wonderful vocation. It's, in some ways, unfortunately, just not my vocation. I realized I could not, having taught first graders, leave the situation they were in. It would have been a wonderful life. So it was a real struggle trying to integrate prayer with, I don't consider myself an activist, maybe someone who participates in other activist communities, but how to integrate activism in the streets, in the plains of the Dakotas with my prayer life. And yeah, there's not a whole lot of resources for that on the face of things to know how to do that. There's Dorothy Day. Eventually I learned about the Berrigans, by which we also mean Liz McAllister, I learned. But if you dig, there are so many resources for people of faith to engage in justice struggles. I mean, starting in the Bible, right? Moses would have died as a kid if not for women committing civil disobedience, saving his life. We have all these biblical resources. We have the early church. And if you look at the Catholic left of the 60s and this sort of what's remembered by historians as a heyday of radical Catholic activism, they were looking at the early church as an example and a model to follow. So I think really digging into Dorothy Day and the Berrigans revealed all these other sources. Now, I don't know. I don't want to bore everyone with a really long answer, but it's an act of prayer for me. It's not, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, who's a rabbi, you pray with your feet. Someone asked me, what are you doing out here in the civil rights movement? Well, I'm praying with my feet. Yeah, praying is not just something you do where it's just you and God talking. It can be that too, but that's an incomplete understanding of what prayer is. Prayer is something you do in community. And churches can come out of the pews and into the streets, quite literally. That's what happened in Charlottesville. It's happened for centuries upon centuries. And to understand justice making as prayer, it really changed my whole understanding of what it is to be a Catholic. That what I was doing in Charlottesville was theology. It wasn't some separate thing from being a Christian. In fact, being a Christian provides a bit of a responsibility. There's some tall demands for Christians that Jesus lays out, right? So I couldn't just have this, what I understood at the time to be monastic prayer, which I understand now was not the right model. I didn't understand monasticism. As a sort of individualist, I couldn't have an individualistic life with God and then just go focus on making money and having a cool house and stuff. I say this, I live 4 blocks from the beach in LA, so turns out I got a cool situation anyway, but it can't be apart from the life of movements. I don't know how else to say it. That my prayer life takes place in my room with God, but it also takes place just as centrally with other people doing justice, working their liberation. I can talk more, but I really don't want to. Thank you, Margaret. I guess I have a question, since I don't want to force this weird silence where you feel like you have to come up with a question. I'd be interested, I'm happy to just go to the next question, but I would also be interested if anybody wants to talk, how do you understand the connection between prayer and justice making? I don't have this figured out. It's something I'm older than you, but I'm not that much older than you. I don't know. I don't know how to do it. It's something I'm feeling out. So if anybody wants to add their 2 cents, please.
I think we have one question up there.
How do you work within the Catholic Church to combat the patriarchy / things in the Catholic Church that are systematically not right in terms of social justice?
So the question was, how do you combat injustices within the Catholic Church, being a Catholic? Is that a good summary? Well, yeah, I don't do it enough or very well, that's for sure. I mean, one thing is to just denounce what should be denounced. Patriarchy is unacceptable. and I exist in a patriarchy, and I'm not going to leave it. It's my spiritual home, the Catholic Church. But women just have equal dignity in standing before God as men. I don't know what else to say. Same with genderqueer people who get left out of the conversation. And I think, I don't know the answer to your question, but the best guess I can estimate, and I don't know what it means concretely, is to follow the logical consequences of that stance and refuse to do otherwise. Just to not accept the patriarchy. I don't know what it means. It's something for a loving, justice-seeking community to figure out, not me. And I would especially look to women and genderqueer people on this. I mean, there's like Roy Bourgeois is a great resource. He's a priest who got excommunicated because of his stance on women priesthood. But there's also the Women's Ordination Conference, and they're taking the leadership on this very firmly. And I encourage all of you to write down this name, Women's Ordination Conference. Go look them up, see the work they're doing. They're doing wonderful work, and I think that it should be working with them. Read the work of Jamie Manson, a National Catholic Reporter, who's written some great things about Pope Francis, patriarchy, etc. Follow their lead. The point is not for people like me to have answers, but to follow the leadership of people already doing it, to seek out those groups that have paved this way already. I guess that's the best I got. What's your name?
Mark.
Thank you. That's Manson, Jamie Manson, highly recommended.
Does anybody have any other?
I don't really know how to put this. My name is Ann Rowthorne. I'm at the Collegeville Institute. And I have been a peace protester all my life. And I've been a member of Witness for Disarmament. And yes, on every Good Friday, we go and protest the nuclear armaments at the submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. One of the things that, and I hear you, and I agree with everything you say. There's one piece that I just would like to know your opinion. There's a huge divide in this country, well, many divides, and there's a piece of me that feels sympathy, and I don't know how to get through it, with the white middle-class worker whose kids have college debt. They're doing 3 jobs to get by. The adult children are living at home. Their lives are a mess. They're tied up with drugs and alcoholism because they're so defeated. And there are a whole lot of people like this in this country. And it worries me profoundly. And they are probably white supremacists, but I'd hate to call them that, and I don't know how to have a dialogue on this sort of missing generation, but there are a lot of these, white people like that, and I don't know, I'd just like to have your comments and see how we can address both white supremacy and white people that are just so hopelessly alienated that, okay, I'll just leave it there.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a good question, and not to repeat myself, I really don't have an answer, but it's something I've struggled with as well, being in Charlottesville. And I think it's good to highlight 2 things at the outset, and maybe this is my full answer, is just to highlight these 2 caveats. One is that it's important to distinguish between encountering someone in private and talking to them as a human and encountering them in public as a representative of a group, right? So if I were to sit down with the head of the white supremacists in Charlottesville, the guy I got arrested next to, if I were to find myself in a room alone with him, I wouldn't protest him. It's my responsibility to talk to him and see what I can do about his conscience. And if I can move him 1%, then good, that's good. And to meet a human as a human. So this is separate from, I think what you're asking is separate from the issue is how do we, if these people were to have a rally under the banner of the Traditionalist Worker Party, which is a white supremacist group, which describes a lot of their members, what you just described, That's different, right? We're not going to meet them and say, oh, how do we convert you now that you're protesting out here and calling for the destruction of the Jews and black people? It's inappropriate in that sense to say, hey, let's have a dialogue, you and me as two white people. That is the inappropriate response. And it seems to me what you're asking is, how do we encounter them as people aside from this street encounter? So I guess I just want to differentiate. There's two different modes of encountering these people, and I think that's important. And two is to mention that what you asked is, I think, a really essential question in grappling with white supremacy today. I think it's also important to mention that white supremacy does not just come from the poor class, the working class, right? The poor class and the working class have very rarely produced the dominant thoughts of the day, the ideologies, right? These are mass-produced by powerful people. The original KKK wasn't a bunch of what you would call rednecks or hicks, right? It was newspaper editors, lawyers. This is who it was, I think, in 1866. It was prominent people, elites. And that was the same for the second and third waves of the KKK. And again, this is legislators codified white supremacy. So with those two caveats, I don't know. I mean, I would love to hear what you thought of it. I don't have answers for this. I think it's important that you highlight this because we have to do it in a way that doesn't, avoiding a both sidesism where, well, the left can dehumanize and the far right white supremacists can dehumanize. I don't know that it does a service to combating white supremacy to just go out there and call people scum, you white supremacist middle-class scum. I don't think that's going to move the needle where we want it to go. I think it might further entrench people into their spaces. How do we do that? I don't know. I think a better community would be able to answer that than the one we have. And I certainly don't represent the voice of that better community that we don't have. So I don't know. That's a great question.
As we wrap up here, Eric, I have just one final thought and question. What is one actionable step that you think we can take as we leave here to combat white supremacy, but then also live in the vision that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had? And if there's anybody else that wants to share something as well, that would also be great. But an actionable step that you're going to take.
Look up the closest chapter of Black Lives Matter and contact them and tell them you are willing to support them. What do you want? There are 1,000 other things to do that are great. If you ask for one, I would love to hear from others.
Oops. Hi. So just kind of like going off of like actionable steps, like I think just something that maybe like some of us could do, or another step could be just like knowledge and gaining that knowledge, because I think once you know more, like you know more and you're more sympathetic, and therefore like spreading that awareness helps as well, if that makes sense. That's what I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is there anybody else?
And if I could add just real quick to Black Lives Matter, if you're not comfortable contacting them for whatever reason, SURJ, S-U-R-J, Showing Up for Racial Justice, made up mostly of white people, but it's a coalition of people explicitly trying to take their own initiative so that people of color don't have to have this extra layer of, well, I'm trying to survive and liberate myself, but I'm also going to give you orders now. So if you'd rather contact SURJ, good, look up the closest S-U-R-J, Showing Up for Racial Justice.
Let's give Eric a huge round of applause for his work today.